especially in this area where the Ottoman soldiers and increasingly the civilians were going. Armenian partisan groups, many times aided by Cossacks, simply butchered the people, mostly Kurds, Muslims who were going from that territory, killed them on the roads. The stories that come from the people there are extremely gruesome. And I'm not going to bother to tell you many of them because I don't want to see people getting sick in front of me, but I'll give you an indication. The people were tremendously thirsty in an area where there were streams running with water. And the reason they were thirsty, the reason they were dying of dehydration, was the streams were so polluted with human bodies and blood that they couldn't possibly drink from them. In the area where the soldiers and especially where the civilians were trying to escape, the area called the Hizan area, or Karchakhan, which is directly to the south of the lake, we get an idea pretty much of what was going on. It's an area in which, once again, guerrillas have a reasonably good time because of the mountainous area, the mountainous terrain. The road from Givash, the main road of the territory, the main road and the telegraph line you see up north is pretty much the only way for large amounts of people to go through. The road to the south, that you see down through Hizan, is very much a secondary road. But it's still conceivable that people could use that. The telegraph line, as you can see, runs along the main road south of the lake. This road is the only way the people can get out. The secondary road, a few. No other road is suitable. Both are needed also by retreating Ottoman soldiers so that they can regroup on the other side of the lake and so that they can stand against the Russians there. Where do Armenians revolt? Where do they attack? In exactly the place where they can do the most damage. In Karchakhan, in Hizan. They force the Ottoman army, which needs all the people it can get up fighting the Russians, they force the Ottoman army to leave battalions behind to protect the Muslim population from Armenian gangs, something they have a very hard time doing in the mountains. Once again, communications. Some detail of what happens in communications. Again, the detail. The detail is what gives us the answers for what went on. In order to understand these things, you can talk about generalities, as I have somewhat. But in order to really understand the difficulties that the Ottomans had because of the Armenians, you have to look at the details. How in the world could Van, the southeastern headquarters, the headquarters of the army that was standing against the Russians on the Iranian border, how could it possibly communicate? The only answer is it had to have telegraph lines. It could literally take weeks for soldiers to move across these mountainous roads, especially in the wartime. The primary line of telegraph communication was the one that went from Van and down south around the lake and continued all the way over to Istanbul. There was a secondary line, another line that went to the south, and that line was not nearly as effective. That line went down here, got all the way to here to Navy, and then stopped. Because the mountains were so high, they hadn't been able to put the telegraph line through. So once you got down there, you had a choice. You could either try to communicate from here to Chatak and send messengers over here, or what usually happened, especially with those Baghdad messages I mentioned before, you could go down here by messenger over the mountains on a donkey or a horse, sometimes on foot, to get to the Baghdad telegraph line that would get you down to Iraq and then ultimately over to Istanbul. Notice the two lines lead messages. There basically then are three ways that you could possibly operate. You could operate by going straight across under the lake, you can go south, or you can go sort of a little bit to the south, and then in both the southern ways, you have to use messengers. Other than that, you cannot communicate. You can't get out. So if you were an Armenian who wanted to do the massive damage, the most massive damage you possibly can to the Ottoman forces, where would you attack? And the places you would attack, of course, are those. And that's exactly where the attacks took place. They took place at Bashkale, they took place at Chatak, and they took place on the Givash Road. It cannot be an accident that these were exactly the places where the Russians would have most wanted people to attack, where the Ottoman army would be most seriously damaged as the Russians were moving in. It cannot be an accident. It also is not an accident that civilians were attacked. To a certain extent, there was, of course, hatred. To a certain extent, there was a lot of long-standing animosity. But it's also true, and something that's been proven in wars from the American Civil War and many Ottoman wars, is that civilians on the road destroy a military unit, especially when you have an entire province running for its lives. The soldiers have to stop on the roads. They can't get through. But especially, as I said, they have to stop and protect the civilians from the attacks of the guerrillas. The result is the soldiers stay away from the front. The result is communication is very difficult. The result is that military units move much more slowly. The result is that the Russians benefit. And there's no better example of this drawing forces away than what's called the Battle of Dilman. Because it may be, very possibly, the reason, this battle, the reason that the Ottomans lost in southeastern Anatolia. Dilman is an area up here in Iran. The Ottomans planned to move down this way from here and up here from Baghdad and to have a concerted attack in this direction. The idea, and it was a very sound idea, was that the Russian forces were concentrated on the border between Russia itself and the northern part of the Ottoman Empire. That the Ottomans would defeat the relatively weaker forces in Iran and would turn the flank of the Russians. This was tremendously important, not simply from a military, purely military viewpoint, a tactical viewpoint, but also because it was a prestige item. So the Ottomans were very weak in cavalry. In order to have the forces they needed in cavalry, they had to have the Kurdish tribesmen on their side. Well, the Kurdish tribesmen, they weren't completely loyal, shall we say. They tended to go with the side that looked best. It's not that they loved the Russians, but they weren't about to fight on the side of the Ottomans if they thought the Ottomans were going to lose. Basically, they'd sit out the war, which ultimately is what many of them did. The Ottomans also wanted to draw to their side the Turks that lived in the northwestern part of Iran and ultimately the southern part of Russia. Now, whether this would have been completely successful, we'll never know. It surely would have discomfited the Russians tremendously. It would have caused them to move many of the troops that they had fighting against the Ottomans in the Erzurum province over to the west. It would have forced them to move them all out to defend. It would have caused them tremendous difficulties. It would have been one of the smartest moves the Ottomans could have made. It would have been. The Ottomans had a slight numeric advantage. They had just enough men so that they should have been able to get through the Russians. As the Russians realized, when they realized the Turks were coming, they pulled every single man they could, and they put up their defensive lines at Dilman. They were, in theory, outnumbered. I say in theory outnumbered because the Ottomans, in theory, had about 30% more troops than the Russians, and the Russian defenses weren't all that good, and the Russians should have been able to be defeated. The idea, again, where they would go, and finally, the Battle of Dilman. The Turks move up to Dilman, but when they get there, they don't have that 30% of extra men. When they get there, what they have is approximately even odds. And since the Russians are on the defensive, the even odds mean that the Ottomans lose. The Ottomans lose, and because of that loss, they are thrown back. As they're thrown back, they're into a headlong retreat. And as they go into a headlong retreat, the Russians follow and also attack from the north, and soon the Russians are taking over the whole of Van province and much of the east. Ultimately, the Ottomans regroup on the other side of the lake and manage to hold off the Russians for another 6 months or so. But that battle, the Battle of Dilman, was the one that made the ultimate difference on whether the Ottomans would win or lose in southeastern Anatolia. The Ottomans lost because they didn't have the men that they needed. Why didn't they have the men? They didn't have the men because an entire division of soldiers was in Van battling the Armenian rebels. Some of the best soldiers in the Ottoman army, the Von Mobile Gendarmerie Division, 3,000 men had to be delegated to fight the Armenians behind the lines. Altogether, more than 6,000 Ottoman troops had to be used to fight the Armenians in the Van province alone. 6,000 troops. That would have been the difference. It might have been the war. Who knows? We never will know. We can't tell how history might have worked out. But we do know for sure, that it was the Armenian rebels who caused the Turks to lose the Battle of Dilmun.